The knock came at midnight, and Silas Bram knew before he opened the door that the world he had built for 20 years was about to end. He had been sitting by the wood stove with a cup of coffee gone cold in his hand, listening to the wind move across the high pasture the way it always did in late October when the sound came. 3 raps, not the frantic pounding of a man in trouble, not the confident thump of a neighbor. 3 slow, deliberate knocks, spaced like a heartbeat, from someone who had walked a long way to make them. Silas set the cup down. The lamp threw his shadow long across the plank floor of the cabin he had built with his own hands the summer after the burial. He was 54 years old. He had not opened his door to a stranger in 20 years. He had not needed to. He lifted the rifle from the hook above the doorframe more out of habit than fear, and he slid the bolt back, and he opened the door 6 inches into the black Montana night. A woman stood on his porch. She was smaller than he expected, wrapped in a coat 2 sizes too large for her, and there was blood at the corner of her mouth that had dried into a dark brown crust. Behind her, on the second step, a child of perhaps 7 years old was sitting on a carpet bag, both hands folded in her lap, the way a person folds their hands when they are trying very hard not to shake. The woman looked at Silas. Her eyes were the color of river stone. She did not ask to come in. She did not explain herself. She said, "Your brother sent me." Silas did not move for a long moment. His brother had been dead for 20 years. "Before we go any further tonight, wherever you're settled in, by the kitchen, by the window, by the lamp beside your chair, take a moment and tell us in the comments where you're listening from. We love knowing who's with us when a story like this begins. Now, come back to that porch in Montana, because Silas is about to make a choice that will unmake the life he has spent 2 decades building." He stepped back and opened the door the rest of the way. The woman came in first. She moved like a person who had been hurt somewhere the eye could not see. The child followed with the carpet bag clutched against her chest, and she stopped in the middle of the room and looked at everything. The wood stove, the shelf of books, the tin cup, the single chair, with the careful blankness of a child who has already learned that noticing things out loud can get you struck. Silas closed the door and set the rifle down on the table. He said, "Sit by the fire. Both of you." The woman guided the child to the rug and knelt beside her and unbuttoned the child's coat with fingers that fumbled twice. Silas watched. He put more wood on the stove. He poured water from the pitcher into the kettle and set the kettle on the iron. He said, "What's your name?" She said, "Ruth." "This is Ellie." He said, "My brother's been dead 20 years. Ruth did not look at him. She was rubbing the child's small hands between her own. She said, "I know. He wrote me before he died. He told me if I was ever in a place I couldn't get out of, I was to come here." He said his brother Silas would open the door. The kettle began to tick against the iron. Silas stood with his back to them, and he stared at the wall he had chinked with clay the second summer, and he tried to remember what his brother's handwriting looked like, and he could not. 20 years is a long time to hold on to the shape of anyone's letters. He said, "How did he know you?" Ruth said, "I was 14 when he found me. He was riding through Bannack. My father had sold me to a man for 2 mules and a rifle. Ansel took me out of that house in the middle of the night and put me on a train east and paid a woman in St. Louis to teach me to read and to sew and to become someone other than what my father made me. He wrote me every month for 2 years. Then the letters stopped. I heard later he had died in the storm of '86. Silas closed his eyes. His brother Ansel had died in the Great Die-Up, in the winter that killed half the cattle in the territory and most of the men fool enough to be out in it. Silas had found him in a draw 3 miles from the north fence, frozen, kneeling with his arms around a calf that was also frozen. He had buried them both together because he could not bring himself to separate them. He had not known any of what Ruth was telling him. He had not known his brother had a heart big enough to reach into a house in Bannack and lift a girl out of it. He turned around. He said, "Who did that to your mouth?" Ruth touched her lip. "The man I married." "Where is he?" 2 days behind us. Maybe less. He has 3 men with him, and he owns the sheriff in Miles City, and he owns the judge in Bozeman, and he owns most of the land between here and the Yellowstone. His name is Cyrus Ballard." Silas knew the name. Every rancher between the Musselshell and the Canadian line knew the name Cyrus Ballard. He was the kind of man who bought land by making sure the people who owned it stopped being able to defend it. Silas poured the hot water into a basin, and he brought it to Ruth with a clean cloth, and he set them on the floor beside her. He said, "You take that room through there. The child sleeps with you. I'll be by the stove. In the morning I'll ride the fence line and think on this. Ruth looked up at him. The lamplight caught her face, and for the first time, he saw how young she still was under the exhaustion. She was maybe 30. She said, "You don't know me. You don't owe me anything." Silas said, "My brother opened a door for you. I reckon I can open one too." He turned away before she could answer, because he did not want her to see his face while he was still working out what it meant that Ansel had been better than him for 20 years, and he had never known. The morning came gray and cold with a smell of snow that would not fall for another week. Silas was out at the corral before the sun cleared the eastern ridge. Saddling the buckskin gelding, he called trouble because the horse had been nothing but that for the first 3 years of his life, and then had turned, without warning, into the finest animal Silas had ever owned. He was tightening the cinch when he heard the cabin door, and he did not turn around. Ruth came across the frost-hard ground in his brother's old coat, which she must have found on the peg by the back door. It hung nearly to her ankles. She stopped beside the corral rail. She said, "There's a road that comes in from the south. That's the road he'll take." Silas said, "I know it. I can shoot," Ruth said. "Ansel taught me before he sent me east. I can shoot a rifle straight to 100 yards. I am telling you because I do not want you to try to protect me from a thing I already survived once." Silas looked at her over the buckskin's back. He said, "There's a difference between surviving a thing and being ready to end one. I know that too." He nodded. He said nothing else. He mounted up and he rode the south fence, and all the way down the line he thought about how a man could spend 20 years believing he was alone by choice, and then discover that being alone was just the shape grief had frozen into. When he came back at noon, there was smoke coming from the chimney and the smell of bread from the oven he had not used in 12 years, and the child Ellie was standing on a chair at the window watching for him. When she saw him, she lifted one small hand and pressed it to the glass. She did not smile. She did not wave. She just left her hand there until he was close enough to see it, and then she took it down. Something moved in his chest that he had forgotten how to name. That night, after Ellie was asleep, Ruth sat across from him at the pine table, and she told him the rest. Cyrus Ballard had married her 4 years ago after her first husband had died of a fever in a mining camp. He had seemed kind at first, or at least contained. Within a year he was breaking things when he was angry. Within 2 he was breaking her. She had stayed because there had been nowhere to go, and because Ellie was small, and because a woman with a child and no money in that country was not a woman with choices. She had left 3 weeks ago. She had walked out one night with Ellie on her hip and a carpet bag with 2 dresses and the letters Ansel had written her when she was a girl. She had taken a stagecoach as far as her money would carry her. She had walked the last 40 miles. Silas listened. When she was done, he said, "He'll come here." "Yes. And when he does, he'll expect a widower ranch hand alone in a cabin who won't stand in his way." Ruth said, "Yes." Silas turned the tin cup in his hands. He said, "Strange how the things you've buried tend to come back and ask what you meant to do with your life." Ruth looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You've been alone a long time." He said, "I've been dead a long time. There's a difference. If you have ever loved someone and lost them, if you have ever wondered whether the door you closed 20 years ago could still be opened, think for a moment about what you would have done in Silas Bram's place. Would you have opened that door at midnight? Would you have believed her? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. They came on the 3rd day. Silas saw the dust first. For riders, coming slow up the south road the way men ride when they are certain of their welcome. He was on the porch. Ruth was inside with Ellie. He had cleaned the Winchester that morning, and it was standing against the porch post within reach of his right hand, and he was drinking coffee. The lead rider was a broad-shouldered man in a black wool coat and a gray hat, and a beard trimmed close against the jaw. He rode a blood bay that had cost more than Silas's cabin. The 3 men behind him were the kind of men who ride with men like Cyrus Ballard. One had a scar across the bridge of his nose. One was young and looked pleased with himself. The 3rd was older and did not look pleased with anything. They stopped at the gate. Ballard did not dismount. He said, "You're Silas Bram." Silas said, "I am. My wife's inside your house. There's a woman inside my house. She hasn't told me she was anyone's wife." Ballard's smile did not reach his eyes. He said, "I've come to collect her. I'll pay you for your trouble. $50 for the inconvenience. 100 if you bring her out yourself." Silas set the coffee cup on the porch rail. He said, Get off my land. The younger rider laughed. Ballard did not. Ballard said, Mr. Bram, I own the sheriff in Miles City, and I own the judge in Bozeman. I own the bank that holds the paper on every ranch inside 100 miles of here except yours. And the only reason I don't own yours is because your brother paid it off in '85 and you've had no need to borrow since. That will change. Everything changes. The question is whether you would like the change to be gentle. Silas said, My brother paid a woman in St. Louis to teach a 14-year-old girl to read. He didn't mention it to me. Not in a letter. Not on his deathbed. He kept it to himself for a decade because he figured a good deed announced isn't a good deed anymore. I have been thinking about that for 3 days. I have been thinking about what kind of man does that quietly. And I have been thinking about what kind of man I have been in the same 20 years. Ballard said, That is a very long speech for a man who is about to make a very simple decision. Silas picked up the Winchester. He did not point it. He held it across his forearm the way a man holds a rifle when he is telling you he does not need to point it yet. He said, You have 3 men. I have 1 door and 1 window, and 1 wife of my dead brother, and 1 child who has not spoken since she got here. You will not take them from this porch alive. Whatever else happens today, that will not happen. The older rider spoke for the first time. He said, quietly, Cyrus. He means it. Ballard turned his head slowly and looked at the older man. And the older man did not look away, and something passed between them that had been passing between them for a long time. Ballard turned back to Silas. He said, Tomorrow at dawn I'll come back with 10 men and the sheriff. Silas said, Then tomorrow at dawn I'll be here. They rode out. The dust hung in the still air a long time after they were gone. Ruth came out onto the porch. She had heard everything. She stood beside him, and she said, You can't fight 10 men and a sheriff. Silas said, No. Then what do we do? He said, We ride tonight. Not away. Toward. There's a man in Miles City who was my brother's friend before he was anyone's. A federal marshal named Wren. He's been trying to build a case against Ballard for 6 years, and he has been missing one thing every time. He has been missing a witness who is not afraid to say what she saw. Ruth was quiet. Then she said, I saw him kill a man. 2 years ago. A homesteader named Peterson who wouldn't sell. Ballard shot him in his own kitchen, and the sheriff wrote it as a suicide. Silas looked at her. She said, I have been carrying that for 2 years, and I have been the only person alive who saw it who was not afraid of him. Silas said, You're not the only one now. They rode at dusk. Silas on the buckskin, Ruth on the little sorrel mare his brother had loved, and Ellie in front of Ruth wrapped in a wool blanket. They took the long way, the north track through the timber, and they did not stop until they hit the rail spur at Junction Creek 4 hours before dawn. Silas paid the station man with the last of the money he kept in the coffee tin, and he put Ruth and Ellie on the eastbound to Miles City with a folded note for Marshal Wren, and he watched the train pull away with the child's small hand pressed to the window the way it had pressed to his cabin window 3 days earlier. Then he rode back, alone, to be at his cabin at dawn, because the plan required them to believe she was still there. The sky was pale gray when he heard the horses. He counted them by ear before he could see them. 11. Ballard had brought 1 more than he had promised. Silas was in the cabin with the door barred and the shutters closed and the rifle across his knees, and he was calm the way a man is calm when he has already made his peace with whatever comes. Ballard called from the yard. Bram, send her out. Silas said nothing. Bram, this ends one of 2 ways. Silas said, Through the door. It ends one way. Come and see. The first bullet came through the shutter and buried itself in the log beside his head. The second came through the door. He returned fire twice, not to hit anyone, just to keep them honest. And then he moved to the back window and slipped out and around the woodpile and into the corral, where trouble was already saddled and waiting because Silas had done this in his mind 100 times in the last 2 nights. He rode out the back gate at a walk so they would not hear him leave. And then when he cleared the ridge, he put the buckskin into a run that would have killed a lesser horse. And he rode east toward the rising sun and the town of Miles City, and the federal marshal his brother had trusted more than anyone else alive. Behind him, Cyrus Ballard was burning down an empty cabin. Ahead of him, on a train pulling into a station, a woman with riverstone eyes was walking a 7-year-old girl into the office of a man who had been waiting 6 years to hear what she was about to say. If this story is reaching you tonight, If you have ever felt that the world has forgotten the people who quietly do the right thing, you are exactly who this story was written for. A like tells us to keep telling stories like Silas Bram's. A subscribe tells us you'll be here when the next one comes. He reached Miles City by late afternoon of the second day. Trouble was lathered white, and Silas himself was gray around the mouth from lack of sleep. And he tied the buckskin at the rail outside the federal office, and he walked in, and he took his hat off. And Ruth was sitting there with Ellie asleep in her lap, and Marshal Wren standing by the window, and Wren turned and looked at him. Wren said, "She told me everything." Silas said, "Is it enough?" Wren said, "It's enough to hang him twice. But we have to take him at his own place, on his own land, because he'll never come into a town where he doesn't own the badge. You up for a ride, Silas?" Silas looked at Ruth. Ruth looked at Silas. She said, "I'm coming with you." Wren said, "Ma'am, I don't." Ruth said, "Marshal, I have been afraid of that man for 4 years. I would like to see his face when he understands he was wrong about what a woman could do to him." Wren looked at her a long moment. Then he nodded once and turned away. That night, in the boarding house across from the marshal's office, Silas sat on the edge of the narrow bed in a room he had rented for Ruth and Ellie, and Ruth sat beside him. And Ellie slept between 2 pillows with her small hand curled around the corner of the wool blanket that had ridden with her all the way from the porch. Ruth said, "I don't know what happens after." Silas said, "After what?" "After he's finished. After the trial. After they take him. I don't know where we go. I don't know what a woman and a child do next in this country." Silas was quiet a long time. Then he said, "You go where the door opens." Ruth turned and looked at him. He was looking at the window, at the dark street beyond it, at nothing. She said, "Silas." He said, "My brother built me that cabin. He put the last nail in it the day before he rode out into that storm. He said he did it because he figured I would need a place after Sarah and the baby went. He said a man could survive anything if he had 4 walls he had raised himself. And I have lived in it for 20 years, and I have kept it as clean as a chapel, and I have not once, in 20 years, felt that it was mine. It was always his. It was always the last thing he did for me. And now you and that child have been in it 3 days, and I stood on the porch, and I told a man with 10 guns he would not take you from it alive, and I meant it. And I have not meant anything that hard since the day I buried my wife." Ruth reached out, and she put her hand over his. Her hand was small and warm, and there were still faint marks around the wrist that would fade in a month and be gone in a year. She said, "Then let it be ours." Silas closed his eyes. They took Ballard 3 days later at his own ranch on the Powder River. He came out onto his porch expecting his men, and found instead a federal marshal with a warrant and 8 deputies with rifles, and, standing at the marshal's left shoulder, his wife in a plain gray dress with a child's hand held tight in her own. He saw her, and he understood, and for one full second his face was the face of a man who had never in his life imagined that the world could turn against him. That was the second Ruth would remember for the rest of her life. That was the second that was worth every night of the 4 years before it. He went for his gun. He was slower than he thought. Wren shot him twice in the chest before his hand reached his belt, and Cyrus Ballard fell backward through his own front door and died on the floor of his own hallway, and the ranch that he had built by taking other people's ranches passed, through the court in Bozeman, first to a receiver and then, over the course of the following year, back in pieces to the families he had stolen it from. Ruth was awarded a widow's share of what remained. It was more money than she had ever seen and less than she had lost. She took it. She gave half of it to the Peterson widow whose husband Ballard had murdered in his own kitchen, and she kept half, and she used the half she kept to buy a piano. She had it hauled by wagon 200 miles north to a small cabin on a high pasture in the country between the Musselshell and the Canadian line, and she set it against the west wall of the front room, where the light from the window would fall on the keys in the late afternoon. That was 3 years ago. Ellie is 10 now. She talks. Not much, but enough. She talks most to the horses, and to a black and white collie that Silas gave her the summer she turned 8, and to Silas himself in the evenings when he comes in from the fence line and takes his boots off by the stove. She calls him Papa. He did not ask her to. She started one day in the second spring and never stopped. Ruth plays the piano at dusk. Silas sits in the chair by the stove, and he listens. And sometimes Ellie climbs into his lap and falls asleep there. And sometimes he puts his hand on Ruth's shoulder as she plays, and she reaches up without looking and covers his hand with hers. Last week, On the anniversary of the day she came to his door, Ruth found Silas out at his brother's grave on the small rise behind the cabin. He had cleaned the stone. He had set fresh pine boughs against it. He was sitting on the ground beside it with his hat in his hands, and he was talking, quietly, to a man who had been dead for 23 years. Ruth did not interrupt. She waited at the edge of the pines until he was done. When he stood up and turned around and saw her, he did not look embarrassed. He said, "I was thanking him." She said, "For what?" He said, "For knocking on my door 20 years after he was in the ground." She walked to him. She put her hand on his chest. She said, "Strange how the things you've given up on tend to find you." He said, "You've been saving that one." She said, "I have." They walked down off the rise together in the last light of the day, and the collie ran out from the cabin to meet them, and Ellie stood in the open doorway with the lamp lit behind her and one small hand raised against the glow, and the wind moved across the high pasture the way it always did in late October, and Silas Bram, who had lived alone for 20 years and had believed, until a knock came at midnight, that alone was the shape his life had frozen into, walked home. Next time, we'll tell you the story of a deaf woman sent alone to a remote ranch because her family was ashamed of her, and the blind rancher who could see her worth from the moment she arrived at his door. Until then, take care of the people who knock, and take care of the door you keep. Good night from all of us.